It is October 1973. A family gathers in a ballroom in New York City. 120 people, descendants of a man who once controlled the equivalent of what economists today estimate at somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. They are celebrating a reunion. None of them are millionaires, not one. The family name is Vanderbilt, and the man who built the fortune, Cornelius, reportedly told his son something before he died. He said, "Any fool can make a fortune. It takes a man of brains to hold on to it." He was right. His family proved it. This is not a story about bad luck. It is not a story about taxes or inflation or market crashes. Those things account for less than 5% of why wealthy families collapse. I've watched this pattern for 2 decades. I've seen it in boardrooms, in estate attorneys' offices, in the quiet conference rooms where families sign documents they don't understand. The pattern is always the same. 7 in 10 families lose the fortune by generation 2. 9 in 10 by generation 3. And right now, this decade, the largest transfer of wealth in human history is underway. Somewhere between $84 and $124 trillion will move between generations by 2048. The architecture is moving. The question is whether the people receiving it understand what they are inheriting. Most of them do not. Here is the first thing that happens. The patriarch builds the fortune. He builds it through sacrifice, through the specific, unrepeatable combination of timing, obsession, and risk tolerance that produces exceptional wealth. He knows exactly how it was built. He rarely explains it to anyone. On paper, the family has everything. In practice, only one person understands it. A 2024 Bank of America study looked at 1,007 high-net-worth families. 52% had no will, no advanced healthcare directive, no durable power of attorney. 52%. These are not poor families. These are wealthy families who simply never finish the paperwork. But the silence runs deeper than documents. Only 10% of families disclose inheritance details to their heirs. 10. The parents, and I have watched this in 11 different families, believe they are protecting their children. They tell themselves, if the children know what is coming, they will stop working, they will stop striving, they will become soft. So they say nothing. What they have actually done is handed their children a machine with no manual, a machine running at full speed, and walked away. The ledger always balances, eventually. You are the second generation. You grew up in a house where nothing was difficult. The tuition was paid, the vacations were real. When you failed, the consequences were absorbed by a structure you never had to understand. You are not lazy. You are educated. You are, by every external measure, prepared. But there is something missing. Research from the Family Business Consulting Group describes it this way. When security and affluence come too easily, the work ethic can be compromised. Success requires sacrifice. But that lesson is difficult to learn when wealth relieves the need for sacrifice. The second generation is often intelligent, often credentialed, often genuinely talented. They simply never developed what the first generation had by necessity, the specific hunger that comes from knowing the flaw could disappear. You cannot teach that hunger in a classroom. You cannot simulate it in a trust document. It is built through years of consequence, real consequence. And the wealthy family, almost by definition, removes consequence from its children's lives. The business that the first generation built has an average lifespan of 50 to 60 years under family ownership. It typically leaves the family sometime late in the second generation or early in the third. Not because the heirs are malicious, because they are unprepared, and because no one told them they were unprepared. The architecture doesn't care who occupies it. It only requires that someone does. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877. At the time of his death, his nominal estate was approximately $100 million, a figure that, adjusted for modern purchasing power, places him among the wealthiest individuals in American history. He left the bulk of it to one son, William. William was disciplined. William understood the architecture. Within a few years, William doubled the fortune. Then William's children took over. The third generation of Vanderbilts built mansions. 13 mansions by some counts, each one a monument to wealth that was being spent rather than compounded. They built Biltmore in North Carolina. They built the Breakers in Newport. They built a version of the family that looked extraordinary from the outside and was hollowing out from within. By 1973, less than 100 years after Cornelius died, the family reunion gathered 120 descendants in a ballroom. None of them were millionaires. In 2019, Anderson Cooper, CNN anchor, Vanderbilt heir, great-great-great-grandson of Cornelius, received an inheritance of $1.5 million from his mother Gloria. $1.5 million. From a fortune that had once been worth, by some estimates, $200 billion in today's terms. Cooper had said publicly before his mother died, there was no trust fund. The name remained, the architecture did not. This is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is arithmetic. It is what happens when wealth moves without the knowledge that created it. Most people, when they hear this story, assume the culprit is taxes, or inflation, or a bad investment, an orange grove in Florida, a collapsed market, bad timing. These things exist, but they are not the architecture. A 20-year study by the Williams Group followed more than 3,200 families. The researchers asked a precise question. Why do wealthy families fail to sustain their wealth across generations? The answers should reframe everything you think you know. Communication failures, 60%. Unprepared heirs, 25%. Family conflict, 10%. Investment mistakes, 3%. 3%. On paper, the estate planning industry exists to solve the technical problems, the taxes, the trusts, the LLCs, the step-up in basis. In practice, those problems account for 5% of wealth transfer failures at most. What destroys generational wealth is not a bad accountant. It is a family that never learned to talk about money, that raised heirs who didn't understand what they were receiving, that fractured along the lines that money always reveals, but never creates. The Pulitzer family built a fortune in the same Gilded Age era as the Vanderbilts. Joseph Pulitzer, the man whose name graces journalism's highest prize, left behind a vast estate. 2 generations later, a grandson lost a significant portion of it in a Florida orange grove investment. The wealth hadn't been protected. It had simply been handed to someone who didn't know what to do with it. The math continues. Here is the irony. The families who lose the most are often the most careful about appearances. They hire the estate attorneys. They set up the trusts. They do the technical work with precision. And then they do not tell their children anything. Jim Grubman, a A family wealth consultant who has spent decades studying these dynamics puts it plainly. He says, "It's a natural human tendency to just believe a good story that seems to have solid backing." The problem, he argues, is that parents respond to the fear of spoiling their children by shielding them from financial decisions entirely. It then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, he said. The silence is meant to protect. It does the opposite. A Citizens Bank survey of 1,500 American adults found that 72% of Americans don't feel confident in their ability to manage a financial windfall. 72%. These are people who will receive money they have not been prepared to steward. The 2024 Bank of America study found that even when parents with adult children said they discussed family wealth plans, 69% claimed they did, those conversations didn't happen until the children were 31 years old on average. 31. By 31, you have already made the decisions that shape your financial habits. Your risk tolerance is formed. Your relationship to money is calcified. You are not learning. You are being told, for the first time, that there is a number attached to your last name. That is not preparation. That is a revelation. And revelations, without context, are rarely actionable. Then the patriarch dies. This is the moment the architecture reveals itself. Not in the estate documents. Those were written in advance, in controlled rooms, by people who were paid to think clearly. The architecture reveals itself in the conversations that happen after the attorney reads the will. Who gets what? Who was told? Who was not told? I've watched this happen. The siblings who discover, at 53 and 48 and 45, that the distribution was not equal. That one brother was given the operating company. That one sister received the investment portfolio. That the house they grew up in, was left to no one in particular, which means it was left to conflict. Family conflict accounts for 10% of wealth destruction, according to the Williams Group's research. But conflict is not randomly distributed. Conflict follows silence. The families who fracture are the families who were never taught the same language. You cannot negotiate with someone who doesn't know what they're negotiating for. You cannot align with a sibling who was told something different than what you were told, or told nothing at all. The fracture point is not the death. The fracture point was 20 years earlier, in all the conversations nobody had. Some families do not follow this pattern. They are worth studying. Cargill Inc. was founded in 1865 by William Wallace Cargill. It is now one of the largest private companies in the world, nearly $120 billion in revenue, 160,000 employees across 66 countries. It has remained in the Cargill family for 4 generations. Assistant Professor Mandy at SMU Lee Kong Chian School of Business, who studies family enterprise succession, points to one thing the Cargill family did correctly above all others. She describes it as distinguishing between management succession and ownership succession. The children who inherit ownership need not be the children who inherit operational control. This is a distinction most wealthy families never make. They assume that the heir to the asset must also be the heir to the responsibility. That the daughter who receives the shares must also run the company. That the son who inherits the portfolio must also manage it. The Cargill family separated these questions, and because they separated them, they could answer both honestly, rather than forcing an heir into a role they were not built for, and watching them fail at scale. Hermes, the Mars family. These names persist not because their heirs were exceptional. They persist because their structures were designed to accommodate imperfect humans over time. On paper, inheritance is a gift. In practice, without structure, it is a problem with a deadline. I want to give you a number. Earlier projections estimated that baby boomers and the silent generation would transfer approximately $84 trillion in assets through 2045. That figure, updated in 2024, has been revised upward. The current estimate, $124 trillion by 2048. This is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in recorded human history. Asset prices grew after the pandemic. Equities up 27%. Real estate up 39%. The wealth is larger than anyone originally modelled, and it is moving. Right now, this decade, toward heirs who, in 72% of cases, do not feel confident in their ability to manage it. Researchers Pretty Kelsey and Zachary Ward at the National Bureau of Economic Research studied wealth mobility from 1850 through 1940, tracking millions of individuals across generations using census records. Their finding was direct. Of the top 0.1% of wealth holders, 85% dropped out of that category within a decade. Among the broader top 1%, 72% fell out within 10 years. Their conclusion? This finding supports the view that exceptional wealth stems from outlier entrepreneurial ability and/or luck, which do not necessarily transmit across generations. The ability that built the wealth does not transfer automatically with the wealth. That sentence is the entire architecture. There is a technical element worth noting. Not because it explains most failures, we have established that it explains very few, but because it is arriving on a specific date, and most families are not prepared. The current estate tax exemption sits at approximately $13.6 million per individual. A married couple can shelter roughly twice that amount from federal estate tax. After 2025, unless Congress acts, that exemption drops by half. For families with wealth in the $10 to $30 million range, this is not a small number. This is the difference between transferring the business intact or watching it fractured by a tax bill. For families with wealth above that threshold, the planning required is already complex. Without action taken before the cliff arrives, the architecture compresses. And yet, a 2024 Bank of America study found that 52% of high net worth families had no will, no healthcare directive, no power of attorney. The technical problem is solvable. It requires a conversation, an attorney, a calendar date, and follow-through. The reasons families don't solve it are the same reasons they lose everything else. They don't talk about it. They assume there is more time. They believe the wealth will survive their inaction the way it survived everything else. It does not. Here is what you should take from this. The wealth didn't leave the Vanderbilt family because someone made a catastrophic mistake. It left because the architecture was never rebuilt after the first generation. Because the hunger that built the fortune couldn't be manufactured in children who never needed it. Because silence, well-intentioned, protective, parental silence, was mistaken for caution when it was actually abdication. 60% of wealth transfer failures trace back to communication, to conversations that didn't happen, to numbers that were never spoken aloud in the same room, to heirs who arrived at 31 years old and received a revelation instead of a preparation. You didn't inherit the fire, you inherited the building, and nobody showed you how the furnace worked. The families that survive, Cargill, Hermes, Mars, did not survive because they had better tax attorneys. They survived because they treated succession as an ongoing education rather than a single event. They separated management from ownership. They brought heirs into the architecture before the architecture was theirs to manage. The difference between the families who hold and the families who lose is not intelligence. It is not luck. It is whether someone, at some point, sat at a table and said, "Here is what we have. Here is how it works. Here is what it requires of you." 60% of families never have that conversation. 90% lose the wealth by generation 3. The math is the same math. It has always been the same math. Somewhere tonight, another family signs another document on page 3 of 47. The children are not in the room. They are 31. They will be told later, or they will not be told at all. The patriarch believes he is protecting them. He is doing what Cornelius Vanderbilt's descendants did, what the Pulitzer heirs did, what 3,200 families in a 20-year study did right before the ledger closed. He thinks this is about preserving wealth. It was always about transmitting knowledge. The architecture doesn't care who occupies it. It only requires that someone understands it. The ledger always balances. Eventually.